Professor Wu is the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, and co-author of Race, Rights, and Reparation, Law and the Japanese American Internment. And prior to his academic career, he held a clerkship with the late U.S. District Judge Frank J. Battisti in Cleveland and practiced law with the firm of Morrison and Forster in San Francisco. And while there, he devoted a quarter of his time to pro bono work on behalf of indigent clients. So it is my pleasure to give a warm welcome to Professor Frank H. Wu.
Good afternoon. Delighted to be here with you, talking about issues of race, diversity, the changing face of our nation, some of the subjects that are most fraught, most tense in this anxious era of ours. I hope to provoke you to think for yourselves, not persuade you to think as I do, to think about these issues with a new perspective, one that you haven't heard before. I'll be talking to you today about the model minority myth. Even if you haven't heard that term before, I'm confident that you know the stereotype. That's what it is. It's an image, one of the predominant images of people of Asian descent, East and South, here in the US. It's the image that we're all whiz kid, rocket scientist, child prodigies, right? It's the idea that I must have graduated from high school when I was 10, from college by the time I was 12, with perfect SAT scores and so on. It's the idea that I learned to play the violin at an early age before I even started kindergarten, and then the piano. And by the time I was a youngster, I was playing the violin at Carnegie Hall, or the piano, or maybe I was playing the violin and piano simultaneously, right? It's the notion that I can do calculus in my head. It's this idea that our parents arrived here penniless, strangers from another shore, that if we got an A- on a report card, we were beaten. It's the diligent, up by your own bootstraps myth with a Confucian twist, right? With a slightly different look to it. And what I'd like to do is debunk this model minority myth, explain why, like every racial stereotype, it's dangerous, even though on the surface, it seems positive. After all, we don't want to just be politically correct or hypersensitive. If someone says, you're smart, you're hardworking, how could we possibly object? People sometimes say that to me. What's wrong with you? We're trying to pay you a compliment. So being a lawyer and a law professor, whenever I talk, I have a caveat, a disclaimer. And so my caveat and my disclaimer is this. There's nothing wrong with being smart and hardworking. We should applaud that. We should encourage it. It's wonderful to see people invest in higher education, to take seriously that they can improve their lot in lives, to be dedicated, disciplined. All of that is commendable. And I don't want anyone to think that for a moment I would take anything away from my parents or your parents or grandparents, those who achieve phenomenal success. I look to them with so much respect. I literally would not be here if my parents hadn't come here to the US and met here. And then I wouldn't have done any of the things that you've heard from my background if they hadn't set high standards and encouraged me. So I want to be clear. To be smart, to be hardworking, those are commendable traits. That's what we should encourage everyone to aspire to. My concern is different. My concern is when Asian Americans are portrayed as somehow racially smart and hardworking, as if they have an Oriental secret, as if it's something that's unique to them genetically or culturally. That's what worries me. And I'd like to take some time to explain to you why this is so troubling, concerning, how it shows that we've fallen short on a promise that we've made to each other here in the New World, in a diverse democracy, an experiment in self-governance, that we will break free from these racial stereotypes. We will allow people to write the scripts of their own lives, to chart their own destinies. And also being a law professor, I always usually make 3 points. So I'm going to make 3 points. The first is that the model minority myth is inaccurate on its own terms. It's misleading. Second, that it leads to resentment and prejudice, discrimination, backlash. And third and finally, that it's a form of false flattery. It's not really actually about Asian Americans at all. I'd like to suggest it's a none too subtle way of sending an insult to other people of color. Let me start first, though, with the point that just as a factual matter, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what your politics are, that the model minority myth has at its core a misleading falsehood. And the misleading falsehood is it fails to take into account that Asian Americans, being predominantly foreign-born, are like others who are foreign-born. That is, they're brain drain, they're cream of the crop. It's no surprise that people coming from Asia are so successful and that their US-born descendants are, because they represent the individuals who had achieved the most in their home countries before they migrated. They had human capital or actual capital. That is to say, my parents came here to go to graduate school on scholarships. That's true probably of many of your parents or grandparents, maybe even some of you in this room. It means that the individuals coming here, they're not representative. And to be able to migrate from Asia is not easy. It requires for many people that they migrate within Asia from the distant provinces to a coastal big city, and then that they have that opportunity to obtain a coveted green card, often by showing they have superior skills. So the model minority myth is based on a skewed sample, and many of you here have STEM backgrounds. You're familiar with how to think about these issues. So statistically, the people who are our ancestors, those of us who are Asian American, are not like the people they left behind. They tend to have had higher levels of education, higher levels of wealth, greater access to this chance to cross the ocean and to make a new home here. So because Asian Americans represent brain drain, right away you're starting from a beginning point where the comparison is inapt. If you look at people who are foreign-born of all ethnic backgrounds and compare them to people who are native-born of the same ethnic background, there tend to be marked differences. In fact, ironically, some of the studies suggest that Asian Americans whose families have been here multiple generations regress to the norm. That is, they look more and more American by the time they reach the third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation, in everything from how much schooling they have to even rates of heart disease and so on. If you live here long enough, if your family is here long enough, you do get bigger. That is, we are taller than our cousins overseas, but we also suffer from all of the negative consequences of fast food and the diet that you usually have access to here. So higher levels of hypertension, heart disease, and so on. So my first point is that the model minority myth, if you just want to be factual, and there's also the problem of generalizing about race and ethnicity, these artificial categories that we've created that have tragic histories that are so often used for invidious purposes. But even if we accept that it's okay to compare different communities against each other, the problem with this comparison, this model minority myth, is that it's based on a myth. It's based on this idea that everyone who comes here is literally penniless with nothing but the shirts on their backs. Now, even if they came with only a suitcase and very little, they came with a scholarship. They came with admission to graduate school at Stanford or wherever else. That by itself, that opportunity, shows that they have something that others don't have, including native-born Asian Americans. So that's the first point. The second, though, is that the model minority myth generates its own problems. When I was a kid growing up in Detroit in the 1970s, my parents, they socialized with other people like them, Chinese who had come via Taiwan. And my mother would often say to me, "Why can't you be like so-and-so's son?" Right? And she would compare me to some kid who I sort of knew from the dinner parties that our parents had, who had gotten an SAT score just slightly better than mine. right? And you know what would happen when my mother would compare me with some kid who was the child of a friend of hers? I'd want to go over and punch that kid in the nose. Now, that reaction, I think, is normal. It doesn't show that I was especially violent. That's what everybody wants to do when they're compared this way. Actually, a number of recent studies have come out, done by social scientists, that show that in a workplace setting, even in an enlightened workplace setting where people are educated, they're civilized, they're decent, they think of themselves as colleagues, in a workplace setting, the people who are recognized as overachievers tend to be undermined by coworkers. That is, that we all, to a little extent, live up to or down to the saying Gore Vidal had. He once said, "Every time a friend of mine succeeds, a little part of me dies," right? So we all have this competitive streak in us, and when people are held up, you know, this is a nation that celebrates the underdog, right? We want to see people succeed who come from behind, whether that's in sports or in any other context. So the model minority myth, by suggesting that Asian Americans are uniformly overachievers, right? Well, just think about that term. What does it mean to overachieve? It means to have gotten more than your fair share, more than what others expected. To be an overachiever is to put a target on your back, to say this is somebody and part of a community that is disproportionately represented among the engineers, right? This is a group that we should resent because somehow they've done a little too well. Now, for Asian Americans in particular, there's a long history of this sentiment. As Ronald Takaki, the leading scholar of the subject, pointed out, Asian Americans have long been punished not for their vices, but for their virtues. So the model minority myth is not new. If you go back to the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, so in 1882, Congress started to regulate the borders, and the first time they had done that in a comprehensive way was to exclude people on the basis of ethnic background, specifically Chinese, and then all Asians. There was an Asiatic barred zone for a couple of generations, and people of Asian descent, even if they came legally, could not naturalize. There was a color line, a bar. You had to show you were a free white person or of African nativity or descent to naturalize and become a member of the body politic. If you go back and study the movement, which started in California, right in San Francisco, to keep out people of Chinese descent, do you know what it was based on? The model minority myth. It was based on the claim that Chinese workers, the people who built the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, almost the entire workforce that laid the western half of the tracks consisted of Chinese men, 10 to 12,000. And the railroad barons who competed actually bet who could lay more track in a day, the Chinese coming from the west or the Irish coming from the east. You know that term Chinaman's chance? It comes from that era because the Chinese were assigned tasks that no one else wanted to do, lowered in baskets to dynamite mountain sides where they might not survive. That's where that term comes from. They worked so hard, yet they were excluded from the ceremony when the golden spike was driven at Promontory Point, Utah, to unite and manifest destiny, this great continent of ours. Well, after the railroad was built and Chinese migrated, many of them to San Francisco, there was a recession, and the Chinese were looked at and thought of as working too hard, as too successful. The main premise for the exclusion was that white working men, many of them themselves immigrants, foreigners. So this wasn't about natives versus foreigners. It was about whites versus Asians. The claim that was made was that whites could not compete against Asians. Samuel Gompers, a renowned labor leader, wrote a pamphlet. So he was a union man. And really progressive, liberal, renowned, but anti-Chinese. He wrote a pamphlet in the early 1900s, and when I give speeches, those of you, it's sort of ironic that I say this here on your campus. When I give speeches, I always say to people, Don't take my word for it. Google this. So go ahead and pull out your phone and look this up. Samuel Gompers, he wrote a pamphlet back when that's how you made your points, called Meat versus Rice. That's the actual name of this pamphlet. And it was one of the leading documents arguing for the exclusion. And its argument, he went on for pages making this argument. His argument was as follows. White working men, he was only talking about men, have to eat meat. They can't survive without meat. Whereas the Asiatic, the Oriental, the Mongoloid, they can subsist on rice. So he argued, this is unfair. White people need meat, they need lots of meat. Asian people eat rice. Whites will lose to Asians in this economic competition. That's an early version of the model minority myth. The Asians work too hard. So his conclusion was the only response is to keep out the Chinese and eventually all of the Asians, because that's the fair way to do things, to draw this racial line. So this sort of resentment persists to this day, and the model minority myth, like all other racial stereotypes, can be turned on its head. It can be flipped around. Let me explain how this happens. So that what looks positive one day becomes very negative the next day. What is it to be hardworking? It's to be, as Gompers portrayed it, unfair competition. What is it to be smart? It's to be a geek, a nerd, to just have book knowledge, to not be practical. What is it even to be good at math and science? It's to lack people skills, to not have soul, to not be a leader, right? You know, people sometimes say to me, would you help me fix my laptop? You Asians, you're all so good at that sort of thing. It makes me want to go right over and wipe out their hard drive. Not to be perverse, but because that's a stereotype. And it's a stereotype that's extended to so many fields, even the ones where Asian Americans are thought of as successful or dominating. Think about classical music, for example. Where would Western classical music be if it weren't for Asian and Asian American audiences and performers, right? You wouldn't have classical music at this point. But what is it they say about the Asian prodigy pianist or violinist? They always say technical perfection, but no soul, no character, right? So the very positive trait of playing the notes perfectly is held against you as if you're an automaton, a robot. It's mechanical. You're not really a human being. You can't experience the fullness of life, right? It's this idea that Asian Americans all look alike, that we're humorless, right? We can't be differentiated from each other. Worse than that, the model minority myth generates resentment. How does it do that? Well, this is a moment when we in America, both within the nation and as we look at the global stage, have an acute sense of anxiety. And Asian Americans represent both the rise of the East and the decline of the West to those who would portray an inevitable clash among people on the basis of color of skin, texture of hair, shape of eye. That's not the way I see the world, but there are those who believe that we are headed for this battle among races, and in that they portray Asians and Asian Americans simultaneously with respect. Well, they're doing so well, but with resentment, they're doing too well. It's what motivates quotas in higher education and so much more, this notion of invasion, of takeover, right? You've heard people say when they go to a high school graduation and the valedictorian and the entire rest of the top 10 are named Nguyen, Patel, Kim, and so on. They say, we're the real Americans, right? How come Asians are winning the science fairs, the spelling bees, they're getting all the scholarships, all the prizes? And so this model minority myth, which has that germ of truth, as so many stereotypes do, it gets exaggerated and distorted and turned into a threat, into this sense that if you're not Asian, if you're white, you shouldn't take AP calculus or a science class because the Asians will set too hard of a curve, right? You hear that here in this area, in the suburbs, as white families say, we can't do as well and therefore we have to have preferences to favor whites, not because of any bias that they might face, but because of this sense that the Asians are taking over. So that's my second point, that the model minority myth is too easily abused, and then Asian Americans too easily abused. That even though on the surface it seems superficially positive, that lurking underneath is this sense of racial resentment, and that it provokes it, it stokes that because of this sense built into it of racial competition. Third and finally, though, the model minority myth sometimes isn't even really about Asian Americans. If you go back to where it was first published, in 1967, in the New York Times, in the Sunday magazine, there was a sociologist, William Peterson. He wrote what has been called the single most influential article ever written about Asian Americans. You can still find this. It's not hard to Google. It's called Success Story Japanese American Style. And it's a sympathetic portrayal. This is one generation after World War II. Japanese Americans had been locked up, interned, imprisoned without due process, 120,000 people, 2/3 of them citizens of this nation. Because as the commander of the Western Defense said, a Jap's a Jap and that's all there is to it. Because they were deemed to be enemy aliens, even if they were assimilated, English-speaking, had never been to Tokyo. Men, women, children, the elderly, disabled, all of them locked up. So in 1967, Peterson wrote a lavish article. It had all these photographs, and it was about how Japanese Americans had made it. How after the war had ended, the camps had closed, how they had overcome the bias, and they were successful. They were out-competing whites. So if you looked at their income levels and so on, by objective measures, you might say, wow, this is an ethnic group that is at the top of the heap. Although there too, just as with brain drain, family income levels are highly misleading. Asian Americans tend to have higher levels of education. Once you control for that, once you control for geographic concentration in high income areas, multiple generations contributing to household income, Asian Americans actually, once all that is controlled for, fare less well. Okay, but that's a different point. In Peterson's article, he extolled all of the virtues of Japanese Americans, but there was a catch. It was to point out the vices of African Americans and Hispanics. Now, I'm not interpreting anything, I'm not inferring. He made it explicit because the first half of his article was all about people of Japanese descent here in the US and how great they were. The back half of his article was, and he said, I'm paraphrasing, but this is roughly what he said. He transitioned, he said, this example stands in contrast to what might be called the problem minorities. And he used Japanese Americans as an example. The real point of his article was to say that if you looked at blacks and Hispanics, Negroes and Mexicans in the terms of the day, that whatever measurement you use, they didn't compare as well when you set them against Japanese Americans. So he looked at juvenile delinquency, he looked at income, he looked at various measurements. And that's been a consistent theme. Asian Americans often are held up, and it's good that we talk about race beyond black and white. That's the theme of the book that I wrote. It's not so good when Asian Americans are brought into the picture, not to build bridges, but to divide and conquer, using a long-standing tactic to use Asian Americans as a wedge group, to say in a none too subtle manner, look at the Asians, they made it, why can't you? That's the concern that I have about the model minority myth at the end of the day, that really, far from being a compliment of Asian Americans, it's an insult of other people of color. You know, this Asian American example is not unique. There are other positive stereotypes that when you think about it, they're troubling. I'll give you a few examples. So you still sometimes hear people say something such as, oh, Jews, they're really good at making money. Now, on the surface, That's a positive statement, right? Who wouldn't want to be good at making money? But when you think about it, it fits with anti-Semitic traditions of money lending and usury and of global financial conspiracies. So if someone said in casual conversation to you, oh, Jews, they're good at making money, you pause, you wait, because you want to hear what is said next, because what is said next can be very disturbing, and then it turns out that the person is not really admiring at all, far from it. You sometimes hear people say about blacks, oh, natural athletes. And then a moment later, they say they were bred that way, right? And then they suggest it's all brute strength. It's brawn, it's not brains. That's why African Americans are good at being the linebacker, but not the quarterback, right? Not the manager or coach. And so commentators sometimes, it slips out as they're talking about performance on the field. So even though it sounds like a compliment, he's a natural athlete, it suggests also that that individual didn't really put any effort into it, right? That they don't deserve credit for whatever award they've just won, that it's not because of them as an individual, it's because of them as a racial group. So race is so volatile, we've had such a history with it, that we know to avoid stereotyping, yet the model minority myth seems to violate all these rules. It seems to be an example of a stereotype that we embrace, where we're willing to say, oh, Asians, the model minority, and then talk about them as if they should be copied. I hope that I've shown at least a few reasons why we should be skeptical. I'll conclude by telling you a story, and then we'll open up for dialogue, because that is at the heart of this diversity of ours, this great democracy of ours. You know, when I was a kid growing up, if you told me that you wanted to talk to me about any of these issues, race, civil rights, if you mentioned the model minority myth and so on, I would not have had any interest. You know, I was like any other kid. I just wanted to ride my bicycle around the block, fit in, be normal. We all yearn to belong in that way. And the truth is, though I'm ashamed to admit this now, I was always a little bit embarrassed of my parents and angry with them. I was embarrassed of them because they had accents, they ate funny foods. You know, my dad was always trying to get me to eat chicken feet. When we watched television, they didn't quite laugh at the right time. If there was a dispute with the phone company, they'd need my help straightening it out because my language was better than theirs. And in that awkward role reversal, even though I was a kid, I would have to be their interpreter and translator. No doubt some of you in this room have had those experiences. And I was always a little angry with them because when I would come home from school and I would explain that yet again I'd been teased and taunted, subjected to the common childhood cruelty of the playground. We know now to condemn it as bullying, you know, being called chink and jap and gook, being asked if I ate dogs, if my parents were communist, how I could see with eyes like that. My parents would scold me. They would say, you should try harder to fit in. And so I always figured that my parents were blaming me for all of these experiences. Little did I know. You see, as a kid, I was a little naive. I thought I was smart, but I was a little naive. I figured that it was only as kids that we faced this. I wanted to be like my dad. I wanted to grow up, wear a coat and tie, shave, drive, go off to work, because I figured once you were an adult, you didn't face any of these issues. Little did I know, of course, my father and my mother, they faced all of the same when they went off to work, or if they went to the bank to take out a loan, or if they were shopping. They shielded my brothers and me from all of this. And my parents, they didn't blame me. They blamed themselves. You see, they figured that so strongly did they believe in the American dream that beckoned the world over, promising that San Francisco had a gold mountain, that this was a place of hope and opportunity, as it is. I say all of this as an optimist, as a believer in the same dream. My parents didn't understand that we wouldn't just be accepted, that what they faced, what my brothers and I faced, that it was because we had fallen short on the principles that we as a nation espouse. that this was racial discrimination. They didn't have the language for that. They didn't speak the language of civil rights because they literally spoke another language. And I didn't speak the language of civil rights because I was a kid. And so we didn't quite understand what was happening when we faced all of this. And so it was only much later, when I was mature, that I came to understand how much my parents had internalized, how they figured it was their own fault. You see, they thought it was because they were what others perceived of them as being, foreigners. Although I admire them so much, they did something I could not do. They traveled halfway around the world, resettled, put down new roots, achieved middle-class status, raised a family, prospered, eventually became Asian Americans. But you know, back then we didn't quite understand what was happening. And my parents always wanted me to be an engineer, a scientist, maybe a doctor. You know, when I was 40 years old, my mother said to me, "It's not too late, you can still go to medical school." And I was resentful about that too, but what I later realized is that my parents had learned a lesson. They never articulated it quite this way, but they figured that in law, in the fields that I've chosen to pursue, giving speeches, writing, that all depends on language, it depends on culture, it depends on understanding and fitting in a way that they couldn't. So they thought, and this they did say, if you use numbers, you'll do well. People can't judge you. Then it's not about your identity, it's not about where your grandparents came from. You can have an accent because the numbers are numbers in any language, in any culture, and you'll be better off in what we now call a STEM field. You know what they didn't know and what I didn't know, but what the statistics bear out is even in STEM fields, Asian Americans face a glass ceiling, or what's been called a bamboo ceiling. So that when you look at so many workplaces, I'm astonished, not just in tech, but at accounting firms, law firms, Asian Americans now have decent representation, even arguably for some ethnic groups, over-representation at the entry level. But once you get to managers, once you get to people in charge, once you get to people who are leading that company, unless they were the entrepreneurs who founded it, you find hardly any Asian Americans, even in technical fields where at the lower ranks, they're the predominant group. Why is this? Well, I would suggest to you that it has to do with the prejudice of the model minority myth. This is how it comes full circle, right? Because what is it that the model minority myth tells other people? It tells them that what we do is numbers. It tells them that what we don't do is interact well with other human beings, right? We don't have the character, the soul, the people skills. We're not funny, right? It constrains in the eyes of others and perhaps in our own self-perception the range of activities that Asian Americans engage in and that they are successful at. We are denied the fullness of the human experience. Now, if people are engineers, as most of you in this room are, that's good, that's wonderful. But if all Asian Americans are only engineers, and if that's all they can pursue, if none can be artists or athletes, it is not only that a stereotype is fulfilled, it is that some individuals are denied the dream that they have that doesn't conform with the image that everyone else is carrying around. Now, all of this also, it doesn't have to be in your face, egregious, overt, explicit. Though I wrote a book called Yellow, with a bright yellow cover, to make the argument that race was not literally black and white, I actually wanted to give the book the title Gray and have a dull, drab cover. The publisher would never go for that. They thought yellow was going to sell. A book called Gray would just puzzle people. But it's because I wanted to make another point, that race is also not figuratively, metaphorically, symbolically black and white. We often talk about it that way, as if it's only about villains villains and victims. It's about the KKK, skinheads, neo-Nazis, those who would commit violence, who would shoot or stab or spit upon someone, deny them a job or a home, or seat them when they went out to eat, and those to whom those wrongs are done, upon whose bodies violence is visited, who are powerless, weak, passive, not agents of their own destiny. And there are villains and victims, not just in the past, not just in the Deep South or some other place, but here and now. And I'm dedicated to fighting villains and helping victims. But I wonder if we frame the story that way, which we so often do. That's the conventional narrative. It is one of progress. It is triumphalist. It is, we have overcome these problems. We teach our children not to use the N-word. We're post-racial, right? People said that until about a year ago. This sense that race is framed in this stark manner. I wonder if it allows us too easily to say to ourselves, well, I'm not a villain. I'm not a victim either, so I wash my hands of this matter. To be able to say that we are not complicit. What I'd like to suggest is sometimes this is ambiguous. It's complicated. It isn't a case where you find the smoking gun, where you can say, that person there, they're the wrongdoer. They're the one who espouses hatred. If we just fire them, all will be well. Sometimes in workplaces, in neighborhoods that we live in society as a whole, the villain has long since died, or they can't be easily identified, that culprit. They've fled the scene. Yet we still have the lingering problems. They're structural. They're the burden of history that we share. And they're the microaggressions. Even what seems to be a compliment conceals and signals. It shows us something about what's beneath the surface. For Asian Americans, it's, where are you from? I say Detroit. People furrow their brows. They say, no. They get annoyed. Where are you really from? A question we ask only of some people, selectively. I know I've asked white people, where are you really from? And they get flustered and they say, well, I'm an American. I'm from Iowa, which is exactly the point. They're assured of their identity, even as they doubt mine. And it's also to say I'm a liar. I can't be from the Midwest. After all, just look at me. It's to say that I have no privacy, that I must disclose my ethnicity and then sing and dance in some way, and offer an egg roll or be obsequious like Charlie Chan. It's to say that we are always, in the minds of others, first and foremost, Orientals, Asians, the model minority, the perpetual foreigner. So it's these moments when someone says, I wanted to let you know, you speak English so well. They're really quite surprised. This still happens to me every now and then. I always reply, gee, thanks, so do you. Because what they're really saying is, you don't sound like the image that I have rattling around in the back of my head. You don't sound like you have an accent, like you belong here. It's a sense of surprise. That's how the model minority myth works. It's not always open like that. Sometimes it is. But sometimes you wonder when you interview for a job, and the questions you're asked, if maybe the person talking to you is just thinking back fondly to their childhood and their favorite Bruce Lee movie or Jackie Chan, and that's who they see you as the martial arts kung fu expert, as the rocket scientist grown up, but don't understand that you're applying to be a lawyer or for a different job. Not one that emphasizes the skills that they would assign to you, but that is about the strengths you as an individual actually have. When we talk about the model minority myth, we are able to glimpse and have an insight into the complexities of race. This isn't easy. Race, when you look here on this campus, when you walk around any selective college, you realize it doesn't matter who you are, and it's not a claim of ethnic pride. You realize that race is not literally black and white, that people don't fit just neatly into one of two boxes. My proposition to you is that race is also not figuratively black and white. It's not just about the overt instances where someone discriminates. It's also about everything else that we can't quite put our finger on. And we wouldn't say, in this case, it's clear cut. But when you look at the pattern that emerges, you can't help but notice that all of the Asian Americans are concentrated in one area, even though some would rather do something else, and they're all at the bottom. None has risen despite having master's degrees and PhDs and all the training you could possibly wish for. And you wonder to yourself, how did this come to be? We can do better than that. It's why all of us, or our ancestors, however many generations ago, came here. Because they thought that here in America, we believed in a set of ideals, principles that united us in a civic culture through the Constitution, through the Bill of Rights. It is this notion that we are the authors of our own destiny. We write the scripts that we will follow. We are not constrained by stereotypes, the model minority, or any of the others. I'm confident that we will make good on diversity and democracy, but only if we come together, only if we recognize these complexities of how race works at all times, and yet how each of us has a stake in making this community better than it has been, of bequeathing to our children the ideal of the United States of America. Thank you so very much. I'm happy to take questions. We've allocated about 15 minutes. I understand some people are watching remotely. That's great. And so I will do something that law professors are taught never to do. I will answer your question. You see, in law school, and I know we have some lawyers here, including a former student, thank you. In law school, we just started school this week. Professors usually say, that's a good question. What do you think? So I won't do that here. If you ask me a question, I will give you the best answer that I possibly can. And I hope you will challenge anything and everything that I have said.
Hi. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about Southeast Asian communities, because contrary to your first point, a lot of Southeast Asians come to America as refugees, and they have some of the highest poverty rates and the lowest education rates in America. And I was wondering if you could talk about how the model minority erases their experiences.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that point. Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders, for example, you're celebrating AAPI, right? We hardly ever take time to talk about Pacific Islanders. And when you look at the data, if you don't disaggregate it, it's misleading. It gives you a picture of the world that's not accurate. So, you know, I actually, let me preface this by explaining why I wrote the book I wrote. I wrote the book I wrote because I started writing a term paper when I was in college. I was a sophomore. And I wanted to write a term paper about Asian Americans and civil rights. So I went to the library, went to the card catalog room. Most of you don't remember the card catalog room. Google replaced it. But remember when you went to this room and there were these huge cabinets with long drawers you'd pull out, and there'd be index cards, one for every book, actually 3 for every book, by title, by author, by subject. And I looked up Asian Americans and civil rights. You know what? When I went to the library at a fine East Coast private school, there were no books. No one had ever written a book about Asian Americans and civil rights. And when I went and looked at the books about race, there were dozens of books about race. Thick, thin, by liberals, conservatives, historians, sociologists, journalists, old books, new books, you name it. Even though the dust jacket blurb said this has the latest census data, if everyone read this book, the world would be a better place. They touted the virtues of the author. When I read the books, there weren't any Asian Americans in them. Even though the books claimed to be universal, they had these grand titles. This book is comprehensive. Everything about race is in this book. I would read, and then in the first chapter, the author would say, well, there's some Asian people, there's some Hispanics, but I don't really know anything about them, so they're not in this book. And I would be offended, not as an Asian American, I would just be offended as someone who was a student who wanted to get a good grade on my paper and who had eyes, because I could stroll across campus and see this book is wrong. It's wrong in the sense that the picture of the world that it offers us is not accurate. So that's where I always begin, that this is not about, are you Asian American, you want to claim your place in the world? Some of it is about that, but it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is, where your grandparents came from, who you voted for, what academic discipline you're in, what public policies you support. When we talk about any issue, we should start with a picture that's accurate. And the picture the model minority myth presents is not accurate. And let me turn now very specifically to your question. One of the ways it's not accurate is because it altogether omits the experience of Southeast Asians, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Hmong. It omits the experience of Pacific Islanders. It omits a whole history of colonial conquest the United States has. And it even omits something very important about the migration from places such as China, Japan, India, which I'll talk about too. But let me address your very specific question. You are absolutely right. When you look at Southeast Asian groups, if you want to aggregate, if you want to look at the averages, if you want to generalize, if you want to compare, what do you find? You find high school dropout rates, teen pregnancy rates, income levels equivalent to blacks and Hispanics. You find housing segregation, you find gang violence. I'm not touting this, I'm saying we ignore it. We not only ignore it, we deny it deliberately because we say, oh, you Asians, you're all doing so well. Well, what do we have to be worried about? Plus, you're a bunch of foreigners, right? Never mind that these are individuals who naturalized, that in many instances they fought for the United States, and that explains why they're here, or it's their American-born children and grandchildren who deserve every bit as much consideration. Whatever program we have, but Asian Americans sometimes are left out because of the model minority myth, because people explicitly say, you have no problems. And then they add, plus you can always go back to where you came from. That's the perpetual foreigner syndrome, a different subject. You can have me back to talk about that. So you've touched upon a very important point, which is the model minority myth also whitewashes very real racial bias and racial disparities, including among Asian Americans. There's an additional point to this, which is, and this is a very sophisticated crowd, so I'm going to talk about numbers for a moment. Migration from Asia actually tends to have a bipolar distribution. So that even if you take the groups that are thought of as the most well-to-do, so Chinese and South Asians, and you look at contemporary migration now, it has both the people with PhDs, MDs, the brain drain, the white collar, and there's a huge segment, including some who are coming undocumented, who are taxi cab drivers, waiters, right? These two communities are very different, and the first community would disavow the second, right? They wouldn't acknowledge that actually when you talk about people who are undocumented, there's a huge Asian undocumented population. And when you talk about the model minority myth, you're ignoring urban Chinatowns. You're ignoring the people who, when you go out to eat at your favorite Chinese buffet, are making minimum wage or less, right? So thank you. Your point is absolutely well taken, and it's one reason why, one other reason why the model minority myth is dangerous and wrong, but also a reason why when we have celebrations, when we have events, we really have to be all-inclusive and see the diversity within diversity. Not everyone who comes here is a PhD student who had the highest test scores in all of China or India, right? Some of them are people coming from very different circumstances. They're people who are, or whose parents were, both people, right? And who have just struggles that we can't even imagine. And if we can't imagine them, we're not likely to show very much empathy for them. But what's most pernicious is the model minority myth allows all of us, including Asian Americans who tout the tiger mom and so on, to say to them, you're not our concern. You're not one of us, right? And we don't see that disparity. It's masked because of the significant numbers of Chinese and South Asians, Koreans as well, that swamps all these numbers because the Southeast Asians are a much smaller absolute number and much smaller proportion. So thank you. Yes?
Affirmative action and civil rights bills were introduced to help basically minorities, for example, African Americans and Latinos, right? Among my friend, circle of my friends, especially Asian friends, it seems that points are very divided towards affirmative action. Majority of my friends do not like affirmative action because they say, hey, look at SAT scores. Our kids are scoring so well.
Right.
On average, Asian students score 150 points more than other races. So race should not be an issue, be a factor in college admissions. But then, this affirmative action is supposed to help minority groups, and Asian being one small minority group. So what do you think is the correct political stance Asians should take as a group?
So we have 5 minutes left. This subject is far too complicated. Google has been a very generous host. I'd be delighted to come back to speak specifically about that. I'll just make 3 very quick points, just very briefly. Number 1, I'm on the side of everyone who wants to seek a better life for themselves and for their children. Asian American parents and families who want to pursue higher ed, who want their kids to go to the best college, deserve our support. They want nothing different from what any other family of any background wants. So I want to be absolutely clear. I'm on their side, and I have zero doubt, based on what I've seen, that Asian Americans face bias in higher education. I have no doubt about that. That's the first point. Second point, you were very careful, and I commend you. There's a big lie, and people are encouraged to believe this lie. And I use the term big lie advisedly. The big lie is this. Asian Americans, it is true, when you look at the most highly selective institutions, have to score higher than others. But let me be very clear. They score higher than whites. They have to score higher than whites. What does this mean? This means that the real issue here doesn't have to do with affirmative action for African Americans. It has to do with regular racial discrimination in favor of whites. Why? Because A, Asian Americans score higher on average than whites, and B, there are many, 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 many more whites than blacks in the pool. So however you measure this, objectively, the bulk of the effect, negative effect for Asian Americans, comes from competition where it's weighted unfairly for whites. In other words, it's not about affirmative action. So your friends who are angry, they're right to be angry. They should understand who they ought to be angry at. So if you look at higher education, legacy preferences, if your father or mother, usually father, went to the school, result in admission rates sometimes an order of magnitude higher than in the general applicant pool. So understand how much a thumb is being put on the scale there. Now, people point out those individuals often are qualified, but understand too that higher education admissions at selective schools is not about who's qualified and who's not. Everyone who gets in is qualified. It's about among the individuals who are qualified who gets in, because there's a scarcity problem. That's another issue. We just don't have enough seats to go around, and Asian Americans would be adversely affected no matter what. Here's why. Asian Americans apply to selective colleges at 2x the rate of other minority groups, or all other racial groups, sorry, I misspoke, including whites. What does this mean? This means anything you do. So let's say you increase the class size. Let's say you decrease the class size. It's going to have a disproportionate effect on people of Asian descent. That's got nothing to do with affirmative action, preferences, merits, or any program you have at any school will affect Asian Americans in a massive way. And there are also studies that suggest something. Asian Americans value prestigious brands much more in higher education. They place a huge premium and are much less willing, in a way, so I'm going to say something critical about Asian Americans. You know, if you don't get into Harvard, but you go to Princeton instead, I really don't feel bad for you, right? Princeton's a perfectly fine school, and arguably Princeton is a better school than Harvard, right? Or you know, I went to college at Johns Hopkins. It's in the top 10, all right? Do I lie awake at night thinking, oh man, I didn't go to Harvard? No, I don't lie awake thinking that, right? I was a fellow over at Stanford. It all works out, okay? But the third point is, the framing of this whole argument, affirmative action or not, is the wrong framing. The first thing we teach people in law school is if you're going to be an effective advocate, you have to know what question to ask, because the person who controls the question asked has already determined the answer to be given. When we frame this as, should we have affirmative action or not, Anyone who supports diversity is already lost. The real question is, how do we make good on our ideals in a practical way? And for some people, they don't care. If the entering class at Stanford or Berkeley has one African American in it, and for some programs, and remember in California in 1996, voters abolished in the UC system consideration of race. It does not occur, okay? And immediately afterward, and you can look up all this data, for many different programs, law, different graduate schools, you had 0 or 1 African American, not just African Americans. If you look at Southeast Asians, if you look at Berkeley Law School, for example, I think the year after Prop 209 passed, it had either 0 or 1 Filipino, right? I'm not talking about we should have proportionate representation or quotas, but, and I don't have a fancy constitutional theory for this. I'm just going to say something that I believe, and you don't have to believe as I believe. I think if a law school has 0 African Americans, that's not good, right? That's just, we, as a society, we can't have that outcome. That is not an acceptable outcome. Or if it has 0 Filipinos, right? The largest concentration of Filipinos in North America is in Daly City. And if the institutions, the public institutions of higher education in the Bay Area enroll next to no Filipinos, we ought to be worried about that. Right? One last question. You had a question?
You've shared a lot of insightful things that even I didn't know. I thought I'd heard all these things before. So how should we take action? In forums, when do we talk? Or is this kind of a topic which is always smaller of importance than the larger ones that are present, like physical violence? Or because you're talking about subtext, things don't immediately hurt you, less urgent, but still important to talk about.
I'm going to tell one last story in closing. We're already at 1:02. May I have 2.5 minutes? Okay. So, when I was a kid growing up, I was beaten up. I often fought back. I like to think I did pretty well in the scrapes I got into. Even today, even in San Francisco, when I walk down the street, sometimes a kid comes up to me and does the ching chong, karate kung fu moves, howling and hissing. Even if I'm wearing a coat and tie, they're pretty sure I got that black belt on underneath, right? Here's something interesting. When I was a kid on the playground during recess, and all of these issues, this is where they occur. Bullying on the playground during recess when you're 7 years old, right? And my classmates, there's a term now, frenemies, right? They were sort of my friends. And that's what's most troubling, because it's one thing if it's someone who hates you and you know they hate you and they do this, but sometimes it's the people you play with. You think they're your friends, but then it turns out in a moment when they're not thinking, they call you a chink. Or they say, not you, we like you, but they think of your parents as chinks, right? All right, so it didn't happen every day, but it happened almost every day. And when I would say to the teacher, that yet again this had happened, you know what they would say to me? They would say, just tell them, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Any of you ever hear that along with the Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, what are these? And the people pull their eyes back in a slant. That still goes on today, right? By most measurements, bullying is highest among either Asian kids or Muslim kids. Other groups don't get bullied as much, and the bullying comes from all sides. It can be from whites, blacks, Hispanics, it can even be from other Asians, okay? So even as a kid, I thought, the sticks and stones line, I'm not persuaded by it. There's something wrong with it for 2 reasons. The first is, and so I'm going to slightly take issue with what you said, the words lead to the sticks and stones. So yes, the words are almost trivial. They're certainly trivial to the person uttering them. They're traumatic to the person who hears them repeatedly. But it falls on a spectrum. When you look at hate crimes like the killing of Vincent Chin in Detroit, my hometown, I didn't know Chin, but I grew up a few miles from where this happened. In one sentence, 27-year-old in 1982, bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat by auto workers who blamed him for the success of Japanese car companies. Even though he was of Chinese descent, not Japanese, an American, not a foreigner, mistaken identity twice over. Wouldn't have been right if they'd picked more precisely and killed someone of Japanese descent for representing Tokyo and Toyota. But the point of this is, what preceded that bludgeoning death? Chink, Jap, nip. And then they finally said it's because of you little motherfuckers, pardon the language, because you little motherfuckers that were out of work. Those words, they're fighting words. They got people riled up. Alcohol, testosterone, hatred, are all mixed together. So my first concern is, yeah, the words, they are just words. But as we've seen recently, tweets, memes, this all has power. This is the hatred on the web, right? The sophisticated modern version. This is how people are primed to go out and do this. Even ordinary people. They're not bigots through and through, but they go to a rally, a neo-Nazi rally. They get all excited. The Asians are taking over, right? China is rising, and look at all these Asian Americans at your school. How come they get all the goodies? Right? And those words stir people up. But the other reason this sticks and stones retort never persuaded me is, I'll be honest, you know, when you're a kid, you suffer all sorts of physical harm. You fly off a swing set, you knock your teeth out. I actually did that, right? You have high fevers, you tumble downstairs, you break your arm. You know, if you're a kid and you break your arm, especially if you're a boy, you've got street cred, right? You got a cast, like people sign a cast. You're cool for 6 weeks because you're walking around with that cast. You recover. You recover from physical harms that adults couldn't take, right? I look back on that and I think, that's all right, I knocked my teeth out on the swing set. That's a pretty good story, right? I mean, who doesn't do something like that as a kid? It's rough and tumble. But even now, if a car drives by and someone shouts, go back to where you came from, I'll tell you, that packs a wall more than a punch. It reduces me to nothing. It says, not just me, but all of my kin. We don't belong. That we have no rights. So how do we respond? I'm going to give you a law professor's answer. There is no one answer. You don't respond the same way at the workplace or to your new girlfriend's grandmother who says, oh, gee, you're taller than most Chinese, right? You don't immediately say, you're a bigot, right? That's not an appropriate response. You have to calibrate it for the context. It takes multiple strategies, but it takes bridge building. It takes working with others, which requires acknowledging that there's an issue. Truth is, and this is the last thing I'll say, I've never gone hungry at night. I recognize that I'm relatively privileged, that the prejudice I face, even though we don't want to compare suffering, because that contest has no winners, I'm not stereotyped as a thug when I walk down the street. The worst is these karate moves. So it takes understanding that this is all around us, that even if you achieve the highest level of success. So I used to run a campus of the University of California. That's not small, right? My mother was proud I had the title Chancellor. Sounds even better in Mandarin, right? And I would go out and I would fundraise, I'd meet donors, I'd meet alumni, judges, lawyers. I would see important people. In a busy week, I might meet 100 strangers, shake their hands. And I can't tell you how many times, not every day, but every month, sometimes more than once a month, someone would meet me and they'd be surprised. They'd say, really? You're the chancellor? You're the dean? They would look at my card and they would actually do this. They would say, is this title right? They just wouldn't believe that I was the CEO, that I was in charge. They would just tell me to my face, oh, you mean you're an associate dean? I would say, no, I actually am in charge of the place, but here's the kicker. I would usually be staffed by somebody, fundraiser, or CFO, general counsel. Sometimes students would be out there with me, but someone would be there. I think of them as colleagues, but they were always junior to me. They reported to me because I was the CEO. Not once, never in almost 6 years, 10,000 strangers I met, never did anyone look at someone who is a white male and think, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say. Not once anyone looked at anyone who was female or black and think that they were in charge. They always understood they were subordinate to me. But more than once, a dozen times, a couple dozen times, someone will look at white males. And when we were coming in, and they were told, you're going to meet with the Chancellor. They would go over to the white male subordinate to me and shake their hand. And then there'd be this awkward embarrassment when it would be explained, no, that's actually the person staffing me. Now, is that person a racist, a sexist? No, they're just an ordinary person who assumes if they're going to meet the individual in charge, it's going to be a white male. So what did I learn from this? I learned that all women were presumed to be subordinate to me. That's not good. That's just sexism. And that essentially anyone African American was assumed to be subordinate to me. But white men often, not always, but often were assumed to be my superior. I was there just to carry their bags, right? So these issues arise. And once you start looking at them, once you start just realizing that's around us in the world, you start to see that, yes, work twice as hard, study, be successful, but if you really want to achieve, not only for yourself, but for our society, for a community, the potential of this nation, what it stands for, what we are proud of, those principles that we proclaim, regrettably, there are these moments, even in the San Francisco Bay Area, even in the most enlightened workplace, where you have to catch yourself and you have to say, excuse me, I think I need to say something now. And that's not easy. That's why we have sessions such as this. And it's why it's so important to stand up and speak out. Those are my last words. Stand up, speak out. You will be the better for it. So will your community, so will our nation. Thank you so much.